It happen here on a daily basis. Kids get stopped, they get frisked, and they get information gets entered into some kind of database, and we consider that to be one of the most destructive forms of profiling taking place in our community. Now, whether that is something that can be adjusted or not, it goes back to the premise of poor public policy and how this sort of habit that we're all accustomed to seeing now, whether it's a habit that we have to live with or if it's something that can be adjusted to be a little bit less harmful to the residents of Watts.
So you'd say that things have improved, but there's a lot of improvement left to be.
Things have improved, but as one member of the community said to me, that he understands that there are good guys on the law enforcement, in the law enforcement agencies. There's also bad guys, just like there are bad guys in gangs. But 95% of the gangs aren't psychopathic murderers. 95% of gangs are kids that are looking for a place to be and something to insulate them from what they perceive to be the dangers of the community. So we don't like to talk. I don't like to talk about gangs per se, but I have to include, when I'm talking about groups that are at odds, I have to talk about, Democrats and Republicans and Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola and Bloods and Crips and LAPD and sheriffs, because all of them come at odds when you start talking about boundaries, territories, initiatives, and costs. And so if I want to do something with the sheriff in the city, I run up against an objection from somebody, that says in the county, we can't go into the city and do that, and vice versa. The city says, oh no, we can't do that in the city with the county. It's the same kind of territorial competition that drives much of what's wrong in our community. Well, when I first heard about the idea of redevelopment in Watts was, I can't remember exactly. It had to be 6 years ago or so. There was a project called Watts Rising, and a gentleman named John McDonald out of Texas that came to the community and offered bicycles and hot dogs to people to join his call for action to rebuild, the housing projects. And if I'm not mistaken, he was talking about Jordan Downs at that time. It could have been Nickerson Gardens, but doesn't matter. One of the housing projects, and promises throughout the community at the Watts Neighborhood Council meetings and anywhere else he could go that offered, opportunities for young people that have been living in poverty to become overnight millionaires by entering into this huge project. I opposed it, and our organization, WLCAC, opposed it formally. We protested it with the Housing Authority Commission, and eventually that idea went away. It resurfaced later during a conversation I had with Rudy Montiel in his office about this piece of property, and that WLCAC was spending $1.5 million acquiring it. It had been up for sale for a couple of years. No one was interested in it, apparently. And we acquired it and thought that it was important to know and learn about what the ideas and plans were of our neighbor. And we became aware that there were some very, very preliminary conversations about it, but nothing formal. And as time went on, we learned that there were consultants being hired and, some basic design concepts being considered. I raised the question almost immediately as to the intent of the project to either retain or displace its people. I raised it with the Housing Authority, Rudy Montiel, John King. I also raised it in a conversation with Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and anybody else, because I was concerned for not only friends but residents that I know living in Jordan Downs. And I understand that oftentimes it's easier to deal with the problem of blight and poverty by displacing the people that are suffering it, raise the property, and rebuild it in the form of something that is more palatable and easier on the eye.
Can I interrupt and ask a question?
Sure.
Have there been any precedent for this concern about displacing people? Has this happened in the past in the area?
Well, you know, funny thing, in 1981, my father, who was the founder of Watts Labor Community Action Committee, took a group of people, including myself, on a tour of the country. We went to Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Harlem, and down in the Mississippi Delta. And we looked at places that were suffering abject poverty or were in the early throes of redevelopment. And what he pointed out to us and what he taught us about were the early vestiges. What are the earliest appearances of processes that involve regentrification in communities that have been historically of, let's just say, minority descent. And we saw it up close. We could see it as it evolved. We went back and visited over the years and could see how places that suffered abject poverty were brought into very prominent and vital vibrancy by bringing in, you know, in Harlem, you've got Disney store and the Starbucks and the Quiznos, and on the other end of the venue, you've got, you know, Bill Clinton. And I mentioned him twice in this interview. I love Bill Clinton, no issue with Bill Clinton, but his office is at the opposite end of the avenue, and a very high rent situation. And so, yes, it's beautiful, and yes, it receives a lot of tourists. It attracts a lot of tourists and visitors. Yes, it's much, much better looking and acting than it used to be. But what happened to the people? And what happened to the people here is a sort of resounding question. It's one that's confronted the Housing Authority many times. Did we commit to a zero displacement policy after we'd already used the rules to sort of call out the problem tenants, so that what we were left with was a group that may be considered to be more viable, more palatable, less resistance to whatever the change is going to be? And I've listened to John King and Rudy Montiel, and I've heard the town halls and so on, and I understand that there is a very concise explanation for what's taken place here. But unfortunately, I know there are still some that just believe that the explanation is for a period of time prior to the development, not extending back far enough to find out what happened with some of the outspoken critics of wholesale redevelopment.
Because that is like the big hot button issue.
Yes, it is.
Is whether residents will be displaced or
yes,
not.
Yes, it is.
And an ancillary hot button issue is, should there be criteria established for who they will allow to stay in the new development, considering there are people who've been negligent on rent and violated terms of their lease and those issues
yes.
as well. So that is something that I'd like to get as much of your input on as possible.
Sure. Well, you know, we're building a project right now, 64 units, first of two phases. It'll end up being over 120 units of permanent housing for people that were formerly or are homeless with incarceration as a former condition. It's a very, very powerfully courageous thing to do because it's unprecedented. And we're doing it because we believe that people that have suffered the most abject forms of poverty are those that suffer the highest rates of recidivism, the highest rates of homelessness, the highest rates of illiteracy, and so on. So we've devised a program that actually attempts to wrap all of the care and concern that you can wrap around a community to encourage growth into the mainstream. We've studied it. We understand that if you get a bachelor's degree, you're 80% less likely to go back to jail.
Yeah.
If you get a master's degree, you're 95% less likely to go back to jail. If you're employed, you have less opportunity to commit crimes of desperation. And if you are being educated, then your illiteracy rate improves and you become someone that actually has a chance to be educated about what's going on in your community. So we will promote those kinds of services in our complex, and we're hoping that the city will promote those kinds of services within their complex. The empowering aspect of this is that we don't tell people because you've got so many convictions you can't belong. Now certainly if it's a child molester or a serial murderer, we can't bring them in. But we put these things out in front, and then we say, and the housing is yours as long as you do all these other things. If you choose not to do those things, if you walk away from your responsibility to fulfill your commitment, you walk away from the housing. The power of choice has just leveled the playing field for you.
Okay. In terms of Jordan Downs redevelopment, do you think it's a viable thing? Did you think it is? And what are your great concerns about the redevelopment? What could go wrong, and what are your great hopes as well?
Well, my only concern is that what could go wrong may have already gone wrong. And I don't know the answer to this, but in the information that's been presented to me, I just don't know whether 4 years ago or 5 years ago, people being evicted for not having permits on their car on New Year's Eve, or grandma being evicted because grandchild had contact with the authorities. I don't know whether during that window of time there occurred an unprecedented systematic process of evictions that got us to a point where now we're at, let's just say, 2 years before the development, and we institute for all to see a zero displacement policy, and everybody that's here will be here when the development is completed. I don't know. And if somebody can really help me understand that, there's a guy named Redman that used to live here. Redman was a vocal opponent, a very verbal critic of law enforcement policy to put cameras in with the promise that the people would have access to internet as sort of a token reward for being cooperative. It didn't happen. He objected to it, whether it was an open container or some noise he made or what. He ended up out. Now, I don't know all the circumstances, granted, but let's just call that sort of a hypothetical situation. If that occurred, then that's what I would be afraid of.
Certainly, in a lot of the community meetings, the housing personnel have assured the residents over and over and over and over again, and still there's a large distrust issue. I think a lot of the residents still don't believe that there's not going to be evictions.
Well,
what do you think is that gulf between the basis of that distrust?
The truth and the reality. The truth and the reality. The demographics of public housing projects turned overnight. Within a 5-year period, went from a predominantly African American population to a predominantly Latino population. If that was an organic process, sheerly out of the force of people's movement, then I would accept it as a natural transition. But a former deputy chief of police of Los Angeles Police Department told me with tears in his eyes that what started out as a campaign to balance tension between ethnic groups didn't end when the balance occurred, that they kept going. And because it was discovered in the process that the Latino members of the community were much more pliable, many didn't rock the boat, and many just didn't want any focus because they lacked the legal documentation of their citizenship, and for paying, in some cases, twice the going rent, they were able to stay there.
You stay there, I mean within?
Be able to live within the housing project, and in fact, I knew someone that was of questionable legal nature, and when she got her status, because I assisted her in that process and helped her with the lawyers.